Hi, I'm Kevin,
And I'm Amanda.
and we are serving up
All that jam.
All That Jam, Quick Hit. Peter Martin on Wynton Marsalis.
I've always felt I love punk rock, so I love fast music. I've always felt it's harder to play slow music, and I appreciate it more.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, it's still to this day. When I was younger, it definitely was. I mean, I remember playing with Betty Carter, and she would do ballads where it was like 1, 2, 3, 4. That's like one measure, 12
Right.
seconds or whatever, maybe even slower than that. And I didn't know what, I was like 20, 21 years old. I didn't know what to fill in there. And like, so everything I'd fill in with like kind of like there's a groove when you're playing slow still, and there's so much more potential to actually mess up the groove when you're slow because it's so exposed. So yeah, I mean, I agree. It is hard, but like once you can do it, especially for like a ballad and like Abstract Courage. What's the other tune? I'm forgetting all the names because I put them on later. There's another ballad I have on there that's very like, you know, it's very undramatic rhythmically, but I think that we hit the groove really well, but the drama's kind of in the harmony. So it's like playing it slowly and stuff is very much about like just sticking with that traditional ballad groove, but then I put in these kind of more modern things and these more Finding Our Infinity. I'm like, dang, how did I forget that title? But that's another kind of under the radar one. Definitely inspired by Wayne Shorter. I realized I not like overtly, but afterwards I was like, wow, that sounds like Wayne. So some people like
Right.
change the tunes when they feel like I'm like, hey, that's a good influence to have. I love Wayne Shorter. So
T.S. Eliot once said that good poets imitate and great poets steal.
absolutely, absolutely.
All right, so you mentioned Betty Carter. Let's go further back than that. Wynton Marsalis. You met him. He was, I guess, an important part in your development. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, he was really my mentor, and also just like a huge inspiration, somebody that like I really looked up to and admired. I mean, I thought he was so old at the time. He's only like maybe 8 or 9 years older than me. But, when I met him, I was 15 years old. So he was like in his early 20s. And he had just won or was about to win, like within a few months, 2 Grammys for classical and jazz, which was like a huge deal. I guess that had already happened. And he came to St. Louis to play with the St. Louis Symphony. I grew up in St. Louis, and my dad played in the St. Louis Symphony at the time. And my dad was, speaking with him, I guess, on the rehearsal break. And he said, my son and some of his friends are trying to have like this jazz band at their middle school or whatever. I guess I was 14 years old actually at the time. But anyway, Wynton was like, "Oh, bring them down tomorrow if they can. I'd love to meet them and whatever." So I got to come down and meet Wynton, and he was just so like encouraging. And like he's like, "Play something," and I played for him back in his dressing room, and he gave me some advice. I remember he told me about Thelonious Monk, who I'd heard his name, but I'd never heard it. He told me like check out this record. He gave me a list of records. He's like, write these down. Duke Ellington, like all real traditional, like old school, important. I remember he told me about Duke Ellington. Thelonious Monk plays Duke Ellington, that record, great trio record. And, it took me like months to go find it. I had to order it and stuff. And, it was just really inspiring. He gave me his phone number, so I stayed in touch with him. When I first went up to New York to audition at Juilliard, like I was supposed to stay with like this, something happened and it fell through. I remember I called Wynton. He's like, "Oh, you can stay at my place." And I stayed at his apartment, which was totally cool. And like, he was just very encouraging, very helpful. He connected me with, he was kind of the original one that connected me with Roy Hargrove. Cause when we were still in high school, he's like, "You need to check out this trumpet player from Dallas." And when I went to like this, like high school band festival down there, I went and seeked him out because I'd heard his name from Wynton. Wynton was like the internet of jazz before there was an internet, like in the mid 80s. He connected me with Christian McBride. That's how I first met McBride. And so, yeah, he was great. I mean, still to this day, when I see him, it's like I become a little kid again. We're all old now, but yeah. And I got a chance to play with him. I played in his band. I played with Jazz and Lincoln Center for a year in 2000 and done a bunch of things at Jazz and Lincoln Center for them.
So after Winton, how did what who did you go to next? Because I have a list here with Christian McBride, like you mentioned,
Yeah.
Nicholas Payton. I guess you've played with Joshua
Yeah.
Redmond, Terrence Blanchard. I mean, can you just pick someone and like what was the next step after that?
Yeah, so it was a little so I went to New York and went to school for 3 semesters at Juilliard, and then you know, I kinda came back to St. Louis real briefly, but then I went to New Orleans because some friends of mine were in New Orleans, and, like, the scene in New Orleans was super interesting. But while I was in New York, I met Greg Hutchinson, Benny Green, Harry Connick Jr., who's from New Orleans but was actually in New York, and, like, made all these great contacts, Larry Goldings, Brad Meldau. Even though I was going to school uptown, they were down at the new school. I came down and met them. And so it was kind of around this, like, beginning of the Young Lions jazz thing, Roy Hargrove and stuff. So I was sort of in the scene a little bit. And so some of them started kind of getting gigs and, asking me to do stuff. But I went down to New Orleans around that time and really fell in love with the scene too there. So I was kind of going back and forth to New York, but I was like, New Orleans was super exciting. And I met Nicholas Payton. Well, he was still in high school actually then, but Victor Goins, Jermaine Basil, all these great players. It was really one of the best scenes there. And so kind of got established there, even though I was doing stuff in New York as well. And then Joshua Redmond, he was actually coming to New Orleans and playing a little bit, and he had heard Brian Blade, and I was working with Brian Blade a lot, and Chris Thomas, and Joshua was putting together a new band. Brad Meldau was playing with him, and he was about to leave. And so Joshua asked me about playing in his band and ended up getting kind of our trio, Brian Blade, Chris Thomas, and myself became his next band. And that was in 95, end of 94, 95, 96, 97. We toured so much and we made a couple of records and did live at the Village Vanguard and all this stuff. So it was each thing kind of led to another, but it was all this sort of young lion. We never called ourselves Young Lions, but there was some article in the New York Times that had a picture of us and was like, they're the Young Lions, or whatever the hell that meant. And, it was just an exciting time. And a lot of that was spearheaded by Wynton and him a few years before going around the country, connecting young musicians with each other and him. So, I mean, he's really
50
responsible for a
state
lot of that.
strategy, huh? He had a 50
Exactly.
state
Yeah, I
strategy.
think he had a master plan and it kind of worked.
Oh, that's fantastic. So you've played with all these people. How do you balance honoring what they're doing, but bringing your voice in? I guess we're flipping what we asked earlier.
Yeah. I mean, they were all very, I mean, almost like, so Roy Hargrove, he was a huge influence on me, and playing with him, like I learned so much. I mean, we're basically the same age. He was, he's not with us anymore, which is crazy, but he was about a year older than me. But I always looked up to him like he was much older because he was just so together with his music. Like he could play piano, like he knew so much. I mean, and I was around a lot of people that knew a lot of stuff, but there was something about him. He was kind of like the conscience of our generation of players. Like he was always going to sit in. Like all he did was care about music. Like he just lived the music. And so he always left a lot of space in his band. And Betty Carter was a little different. She left space, but it was like she was older than us and was like a master already. So that was like going to grad school with her. But in terms of like playing with my peers, Joshua Redmond and Wynton, even Wynton Marsalis, Roy Hargrove, all these great players, Terrence Blanchard, there was always this big space. It was never like, you're in my band, do this. They'd bring in music. Christian McBride, I'm playing with him at the Village Vanguard next week. And he's like, you got any new tunes? Bring them in. Like it's his band, but it's always a very cooperative thing with this kind of jazz. So for me, it was always natural to kind of keep it that way. And I love working in that kind of framework.
There you go.
Yeah.
So let me ask you a deeper question about jazz in general. Jazz often reflects cultural, social context of its time. How do you
Yeah.
see the role of jazz in today's world?
I mean, in terms of like is there a cultural like kind of commentary that the music can provide? I think yes. I think it always can. Does it connect at different times in that way? I think not always, and not because there isn't that connection and message in the music and the musicians, but I think sometimes it's just sort of timing and like how is the music being marketed? Like how is it being presented to people? And I think sometimes there is a little bit of disconnect, but I think if you have a group of musicians and jazz is such an expansive thing we just did a podcast talking about how they've introduced a new category with the Grammys called alternative jazz, and whether or not that's, so now you have jazz, you have like large, what do they call it? Large group jazz, small group, different Grammys. And now you have alternative jazz because they felt it needed to go, what does that mean? Who the hell knows? But it's like jazz as sort of this big tent that includes a lot of things, I think represents at its core, musicians that want to be creative and want to play music, want to have improvisation as kind of a big part of the framework, but play music for people that want to be challenged when they come to hear the music. In other words, they want to come hear the music and they're okay with it being different, or maybe it's All the Things You Are or Stardust or something, but you can't even tell it's that until the end or something. Whereas a lot of forms of music is like, no, you want it to be a certain way. You want it to be recreated in an energetic and accurate kind of way. So I always think about like when people are like, well, what makes jazz jazz? And I'm like, well, I'm never like, it has to be a swing beat or it has to be blues bass. I mean, these are elements that are typically there, but there's so many different ways to do that. Because I remember when I was coming up, it was like, is Weather Report really jazz, or is that fusion, or is that funk, or and I'm like, well, it's Wayne Shorter and Joe Zawinul, so that should make it jazz right there. Pretty much anything they do. But this idea of like not challenging the listener in an offensive way, but challenging them in a way that you're bringing them in and you're rewarding them, that the closer they listen, the more exciting it is. And typically that's associated with like classical music. And I think that's inaccurate to say that it has to be highbrow or something. But the idea of like, we're going to bring something that's going to challenge the listener. And the more they listen, the more they're going to be able to give energy back to us. And it's going to be a really interesting and edifying musical experience. I think that always has really strong cultural and societal implications, because we want to make music that when people come in, if they pay attention, they're uplifted and something's added to their life that they didn't have before they came. They're not just entertained. We want to, I believe big in entertaining as well, but it's not just that. We want to uplift, we want to edify, we want to, and this is not about like making this that I very much see myself as an entertainer. That's first and foremost. It's like you go to a restaurant. We want to democratize food. Well, can I just get some food too? I'm hungry. We want to give the calories, but we want it to be like super nutritious, but super delicious also. And so I think that that's something that when we do it well as jazz musicians, and just like any kind of great art, is so important to the culture, so important to the society, so important. And, for me traveling around the world, to all these places that I never would have gone had it not been for the music, I took that responsibility to bring it every night as best I could, very seriously. Just like if I'm a waiter at a restaurant, your first responsibility before you remember and say cute things and all this, make sure you bring the food to the table, And so I think that that's when we're doing our job. That's what we're doing. And then we try to elevate it from there.
If you are enjoying All That Jam, please like and subscribe to our social media channels at All That Jam Pod on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, or visit our website, allthatjampod.com. Make sure to sign up for our email list and tune in every week for new episodes.
Also, look for full interviews on our YouTube channel. And remember, stay beautiful, but don't stay underground too long.